Today you are going to hear the story of Karim Nasser, a young man of 29 years old, a Palestinian who grew up in Gaza, surrounded by sirens, smoke, and weapons, believing that dying in the name of honor was the greatest purpose of life. From a very early age, he was trained to fight, to obey, and to serve a cause that promised glory but delivered only emptiness and pain. His marriage to Layla seemed to be the only breath of peace, until an unimaginable tragedy within his own home tore away his honor and everything they held most precious. Between hatred and vengeance, Karim reached the bottom of the pit, but it was there that something extraordinary happened. An unexpected prayer and a few videos of Kirk became sparks that opened the way for a greater miracle. And to begin this story, make sure you are already subscribed here on the channel. Leave your like and write in the comments from which city or country you are watching us, because stories like this prove that no one is ever too far to be reached by grace.
My name is Karim Nasser. I am 29 years old and I grew up believing that my life would never truly belong to me. From my earliest years, the nights of my childhood were not marked by the sound of laughter or stories told by elders, but by the piercing sound of sirens echoing through the streets of Gaza. I remember the trembling of the house when the tanks passed heavily, raising dust and leaving behind a trail of fear that seemed never to fade. The air, heavy with smoke, entered through the cracks in the windows, and for me as a child, that smell became part of everyday life as if it were normal. My father repeated a phrase that shaped my view of the world: "We live to die with honor." I grew up hearing this as if it were a commandment, as if death were not something to fear but rather the only path to dignity. As I grew older, that idea became embedded in every fiber of my identity. At 16 years old, I was recruited and received the nickname that would follow me for a long time: Lionheart. It was a kind of medal of courage, but inside I knew I was just a boy searching for belonging, trying to prove I was strong enough not to shame my family. They demanded discipline, silence, and blind obedience. I memorized passages of the Quran with mechanical devotion, repeating words that sounded grand but often did not penetrate my heart. At the same time, I learned to handle weapons, to march, to obey without questioning. While other young men dreamed of owning a motorcycle or earning a diploma, I was trained to believe that the greatest glory was to give my life in battle. With time, the responsibilities increased. I was no longer just the boy who memorized verses. I became involved in heavier tasks. I handled supply logistics, watched families under suspicion, participated in interrogations that always left marks on me. On the outside, I was the steady soldier, the one with the hard gaze and the body ready to obey. But inside, there was a hole. I wanted to belong, I wanted to be someone seen and respected, but the more I obeyed, the more I felt like only a shadow. Each order carried out, each act executed without thinking, tore away a piece of me that I could not recover. Amid all this, there was also my attempt to sustain the faith I had been taught since childhood. I performed the prayers, observed the fasts, lifted my head, and repeated the words that echoed from the loudspeakers of the minaret. But deep down it felt like no one was listening. The words left my mouth, but my heart remained silent. I felt I was speaking alone, trapped in a lifeless ritual. And it was during Ramadan that this distance became even more painful. While everyone celebrated the fast as a moment of closeness to the divine, I felt only a greater emptiness, an absence that weighed on me like lead. There was, however, a breath within that suffocating routine: Layla Saif. She was my childhood friend, someone who had known my story since the earliest years. When we married, I found in her a sweetness and a strength I had never seen anywhere else. Layla had the ability to look into my eyes and calm the storm that roared inside me. By her side, for some moments, I could believe that there was still goodness in the world, that there was still room for love in the midst of war. When I came home and smelled food from the kitchen, when I saw her softly humming as she arranged the place, it seemed that for an instant I could just be an ordinary man and not a living weapon. But even her love could not erase the nightmares that haunted me. The nights were long, and I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, seeing again in my mind the faces of those who had crossed my path in the darkest tasks. I did not speak of this to her, but I carried it as a secret weight. Sometimes I watched her sleep peacefully and wondered if one day I would be able to rest like that, without shadows hovering over me. The contrast between the harshness of public life and the tenderness of home life was unbearable. During the day I was the rigid soldier, Lionheart, unquestioning obedience. During the night I was only a divided man, fighting against memories that insisted on chasing me. Each day the line between who I truly was and who I pretended to be became more blurred. And then came a specific moment, etched like a photograph that does not fade. I was standing before the minaret, the call to prayer echoing through the streets, the crowd moving toward the mosque. I lifted my eyes, saw that tower rising against the sky, and a question invaded my mind without asking permission. If this is really the path of truth, why do I feel myself sinking more every day? Why is the silence stronger than any answer? That question followed me like a constant whisper, a restlessness I could not silence. I did not have the courage to speak it aloud because to doubt was dangerous. It was like signing a sentence. But inside me, it grew. While everyone around me seemed sure of what they were doing, I felt increasingly distant. It was as if I walked in an endless desert, surrounded by people but alone in my soul. And it was exactly in that contrast between the soldier everyone saw and the man I knew was losing himself that my story began to move towards something I could never have imagined. I did not yet know it, but that emptiness would become the ground where something entirely new could grow. I was still far from understanding, but the crack was already open. And once it exists, it is impossible to go back to being whole in the same way. I still remember clearly that day that changed everything. The sun had barely risen when the news spread among us that a Christian family had narrowly escaped an attack. I knew the reason. The night before, when I saw a woman with a baby in her arms, a Coptic mother walking quickly, I warned her to get out of the way. It was an instinctive, human, almost unconscious gesture. I could not bear the idea of seeing that child crushed in the crossfire. But in an environment where any compassion was interpreted as weakness, that simple act turned into an accusation. Whispers began to circulate, suspicious looks became frequent, till the sentence came, "I had stained the honor of the group by sparing an enemy." That was when darkness fully entered my home. 3 strong knocks at the door announced the visit I feared the most. When I opened it, hooded men pushed me inside with brutality. There were no symbols, no flags, only weapons in hand and coldness in their eyes. I was thrown against the wall, punches and kicks striking me without mercy. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as I tried to resist, but my strength quickly drained away. The worst, however, was not what they did to me. It was what they did in front of me. Layla, the woman who had always given me back a breath of life, was the target of their violence, while I, pinned to the floor, only screamed her name. That scene, more than any battle or torture I had seen, destroyed something inside me. To this day, the echoes of her screams resound like an open wound. When they finally left, they left behind the heaviest silence I had ever experienced. The ceiling fan spun slowly as if mocking our pain, and the floor of our house, once a place of dreams and plans, now seemed like a field of ruins. I crawled to Layla, covered her with a blanket, held her hand, and asked forgiveness dozens of times, but no word came from her. For 3 days, she did not utter a single sentence. She only remained with her eyes lost, as if a part of her soul had been ripped away forever. Stunned, I searched for answers. I went to the imam of the mosque, a man I considered a spiritual leader, someone to whom I had so often entrusted my obedience. I described every detail, begged for advice, for a word that could bring me relief. He looked at me coldly and said, "Perhaps you displeased Allah, perhaps your wife was not properly covered. Perhaps this was only a test." Those words cut me deeper than the punches of the hooded men. I left in shock, my legs trembling and my heart sinking into despair. I expected compassion but found indifference. That same night I sought out the local commander, someone with whom I had shared trenches and battles. I told him what had happened. My voice trembled when I said, "They hurt my wife." He stared at me without emotion and replied, "She is alive. Be grateful for that." Grateful. How could I be grateful seeing the most important person in my life destroyed? It was at that moment that I realized there was no justice in that system, no mercy, not even humanity. What we called faith, discipline, and obedience was only a mask to legitimize dehumanization. I returned home completely broken. Each time I opened the book I had recited since childhood, I found verses that, instead of comfort, legitimized what had happened. There it was written that women captured in war could be treated as property. How could I accept that? How could I continue calling sacred what had destroyed my wife? Every word I read became a knife driven into me. I could no longer pray the same way. When I knelt, I felt nothing but silence, a silence that screamed louder than any bombing. Gradually, the emptiness turned into anger. A voice inside me said that I should take revenge. I knew the faces of those men, I knew where they lived, which paths they walked. I could plan, I could wait, and I could return to them the same pain they had caused me. The idea of revenge became an obsession, a sweet poison that promised me justice, but at the same time consumed me from within. I also considered ending it all. There were moments when the pain was so unbearable that I thought about simply disappearing, ceasing to exist. It was in that state that I found myself one night in an abandoned warehouse, smelling of oil and rust, surrounded by the densest silence I had ever experienced. I was alone, carrying inside me an unbearable mixture of hatred, desire for revenge, and despair. My heart beat unevenly, my hands trembled, and inside my mind a whirlwind of thoughts pushed me further toward the abyss. And it was there, without strength, without faith, and without hope, that a whisper escaped my lips. "If there is a God who sees, speak to me." Those words were not planned, not memorized like the prayers I had repeated all my life. It was only a muffled cry, a plea from the depths of my soul. I did not know if anyone would hear. I did not know if there would be an answer. But at that moment, for the first time, I admitted that the God I had been taught might not be the real one. I admitted that if there was a true God, I needed him to show me who he was, and that simple, desperate cry became the beginning of something I did not yet understand, but that would completely change the course of my life. I was at the bottom of the pit when it all happened. That abandoned warehouse, covered in dust and smelling of burnt oil, seemed like a reflection of my inner state, a forgotten place, steeped in silence and despair. The floor was cold, hard, covered with marks of rust and remnants of old tools. Every detail around me screamed abandonment, and that was exactly how I felt, abandoned by everyone, including the God I believed I had served my entire life. My knees were giving way, my hands trembled, and my heart beat irregularly, as if it could stop at any moment. My breathing came in sobs, heavy, as if the very air had become an enemy. I had tried to scream, but the scream would not come. I'd tried to cry, but the tears had dried before reaching my face. The despair was so dense that it seemed to fill that warehouse, suffocating any hope. I was alone, completely alone, and yet, in that moment of collapse, something happened. Time seemed to change its rhythm. The air became heavier, as if the atmosphere had gained weight. The distant noise of the city suddenly ceased, and an almost supernatural silence took over the space. That was when I sensed a presence. I cannot explain where it came from, because there were no open doors, no illuminated windows, but he was there. In front of me stood a man dressed in white. The color was so intense it did not seem of this world. It was not an ordinary white like worn fabric, but a pure white, without stains, without flaws. The strange thing was that, even though it was so overwhelming, it was not a threatening presence. On the contrary, there was something serene, peaceful, almost familiar about him. There were no weapons in his hands, no judgment in his gaze, only a calm that penetrated straight into my soul. I could not clearly see his face, as if the very light around him blurred his features, but I felt that he saw me completely. Not just the broken man covered in dust and shame who was there, but every detail of my life, every memory, every tear I never cried, every scream I never dared to release. He saw me as no one had ever seen me before. Then he spoke. His voice did not echo like an ordinary sound, it did not only vibrate in my ears. It was as if it had gone straight through my heart. He said, "You were not made for death. Vengeance is mine. You have not been forgotten." Those words pierced me like a sword, but instead of pain, they brought relief. I collapsed. The cry that had been trapped inside me finally burst out. I fell to my knees, crying like a child who meets his father after years of absence. It was a deep cry, without shame, without reserve, carrying all the pain I had accumulated for decades. I felt the tears wetting my face, falling onto the dirty floor of that warehouse. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not afraid of being weak. The despair that had crushed me until then began to transform. I cannot say it became joy, because there was still too much pain inside me. But it was as if a strange peace had settled there, a different silence. Not the empty silence that haunted me, but a silence full of meaning. It was unexplainable. I did not understand who that man was, did not know if it was a vision, a dream, an illusion of my exhausted mind. But I knew one thing: I had been seen. I, who felt invisible even to God, now was certain that someone truly looked at me. When I finally left that warehouse, I was no longer the same. My body still hurt, my heart was still shattered, but there was a different spark inside me. I did not know where it would lead me, but something had begun. That dawn, unable to sleep, I returned home and sat in front of my phone. My hands still trembled, but there was a new restlessness guiding me. I needed to understand what had happened. I opened the browser, took a deep breath, and without knowing exactly what to type, I wrote, "Man in white dream ex-Muslim." Suddenly the screen filled with results. Videos, testimonies, articles, stories of men and women from different countries who had experienced something similar to mine. People who had also seen a man dressed in white in dreams, in visions, in moments of despair. I clicked on one video, and then another. Each testimony seemed to echo what I had just lived. I was not crazy. I was not alone. This was real. As I kept browsing, different content appeared among the recommended videos. A debate by Kirk. I had never heard of him before, but something caught my attention. The title spoke of faith, of morality, of freedom. I decided to watch it. Right from the beginning, I noticed something unusual. It was not only emotion or empty religiosity. It was logic. It was reason. He spoke about God and Christ with solid arguments, connecting faith and reality in a way I had never seen before. Each word of his pierced the bubble of what I had been taught since childhood. I was used to hearing speeches of hatred, of imposition, of fear, but now I saw someone present Christianity in a courageous, rational, and at the same time profoundly human way that moved me in an unexpected way. For the first time, I allowed myself to listen. My mind, which had always been closed, began to consider that perhaps there was another truth, a truth that did not need to be upheld by violence. Kirk was for me the first door that opened. Reason became the first step, and through that path my mind began to be set free. From then on, the domino effect was inevitable. After the debates came the testimonies. I found videos of former Muslims who had encountered the man in white and who declared they had come to know Jesus. Each story touched me deeply because it seemed to describe exactly what I myself had experienced. I spent hours in the middle of the night watching those accounts with headphones on, the volume almost at minimum, fearing someone would find out. And in every word, in every tear of those who testified, I felt as if my very soul was being translated. I could not keep this only to myself. Carefully, on a silent night, I showed one of the videos to Layla. At first she looked with suspicion, her eyes still marked by the pain she carried. But as the words went on, something happened. Her eyes, once dimmed, began to shine again. It was as if a light had pierced the darkness in which she had lived since that tragedy. For the first time in a long while, I saw hope in my wife's eyes. We cried together that night. Not because we understood everything, but because for the first time there was a possibility of healing, a promise that we were not alone. That was how the gospel reached us, not through loud preaching, not in an imposing church, but on the small screen of a cell phone in videos watched in secret. It was through debates, testimonies, and simple, courageous words that the chains imprisoning us since childhood began to break. And that dawn, when I held Layla's hand and saw her eyes full of life again, I knew something was happening. I did not fully understand it, I did not have all the answers, but the process had begun. The man in white, the debates of Kirk, the testimonies of so many others. All of that seemed to converge to the same point, a truth greater than the one I knew, a calling I still could not name, but that was already transforming my heart. I did not know where it would lead us, but I felt that a new journey had begun. The pain was still there, but it no longer had the same power. For the first time in many years, Layla and I could dream that perhaps there was a different future. A future built not on vengeance or fear, but on something new, something real, something we were still about to discover. The weight of the consequences came too quickly, almost without giving me time to breathe. After experiencing that glimpse of hope, I was trying to learn how to deal with the new discoveries. But life did not allow me to hide for long. One seemingly ordinary afternoon, while I was replaying the testimonies on the screen of the laptop, I heard a familiar sound behind me, firm, impatient footsteps that I immediately recognized as Samir's, my cousin. He entered without knocking as usual, and what he saw on the screen was enough. The paused image of a Christian video was displayed before him. He did not say anything, did not shout, did not question. He just looked at me as if he had discovered something disgusting. It was the cold stare of someone who had already decided to report me. It did not take long before the front door was kicked in and heavy hands dragged me out. They put a bag over my head and threw me into a black van. The trip was short, but long enough to fill me with thoughts of death. When they finally removed the cloth from my face, I was in a cement courtyard. The gray, damp walls exuded the smell of moisture and fear. There, in front of me, stood the man who had once been my commander, the one I had called brother. His face showed neither surprise nor anger, only the calculated hardness of someone who believes he is fulfilling a duty. He approached slowly and said, "You have until dawn. Recite the Shahada and come back to us, or die right here." The words fell on me like stones. I knew what that meant. The entire night was a martyrdom. I sat on the cold floor, my hands tied, staring at the darkness as if facing my own end. My thoughts ran over each other. I remembered my father and his phrase about dying with honor. I remembered the years of blind obedience. I remembered Layla and her eyes that had begun to shine again when we watched together the videos that spoke of Jesus. Above all, I remembered that man in white who told me I had not been forgotten. When dawn approached, they dragged me back to the courtyard. The blade was placed before my eyes, reflecting the faint light from the sky. My heart raced, but inside me there was a conviction greater than fear. Then I said with a trembling but firm voice, "I belong to Jesus." The silence that followed seemed to freeze the air. Some laughed, others clenched their fists, but I knew I could not go back. Suddenly, the improbable happened. A thunderous noise cut through the sky, a nearby explosion shook the ground, and chaos erupted. Men shouted orders, gunfire echoed, dust filled the courtyard. It was in this whirlwind that I felt a firm hand pull me. It was Layla. How she managed to get there I still do not know. But she dragged me through a hole in the wall, and together we ran through narrow alleys, stumbling out of breath but alive. Hours later we found refuge in a hidden place, an underground church. There was nothing there that resembled the grandeur of the mosques or the rigidity of the ceremonies I knew. The space was small, lit by candles, filled with the smell of freshly baked bread. The people welcomed us not as strangers but as family. Someone called us brother and sister, simple words, but they echoed deeply inside me. In that environment, prayers were not orders, they were sincere requests. There was no hurry, no show, only voices pleading for peace and hope. It was in this unlikely place that something happened to me and to Layla. One morning they brought a plastic basin full of warm water. I stepped into it with my heart racing, and when I was immersed, I felt as if the weight of an entire life had been placed into the hands of someone greater. As I rose, the water ran down my face like tears that were no longer of pain but of rebirth. Layla was baptized next to me. Her eyes, which had carried darkness for so long, now shone in a way I had not seen since our early days of marriage. We embraced there, aware that nothing would be easy from then on, but that for the first time we were truly free. The consequences were immediate and painful. Families rejected us, friends disappeared, and the shadow of persecution still hovered over us. But even in the midst of loss, there was a community that sustained us. There were prayers that reminded us we were not alone. I knew the price was high, but I also understood that there is no cost too great when one discovers the truth. And, in that improvised shelter with Layla's hand entwined in mine, I realized that our journey was only just beginning. The open persecution had pushed us into that hidden church, and for a while I thought we would find rest there. But I soon realized that, although the walls protected us from the outside world, there were battles that no refuge could prevent. The first was rejection. The news of our choice spread faster than I could have imagined. The few photos that existed of me scattered in relatives' and acquaintances' homes were burned publicly, as if they could erase my story that way. My mother, over the phone, with her voice filled with pain and anger, said only one sentence that would repeat in my mind countless times: "You are no longer my son." That sentence weighed more than any weapon pointed at me. On the other side, Layla suffered as much as I did. Her parents accused her of being bewitched, said she had been seduced by foreign ideas, that she was no longer pure, that she was no longer part of the family. I saw in her eyes the same pain I carried, and together we learned what it meant to be orphans while still alive. There were nights when she cried in silence, and I knew that her parents' words echoed in her heart in the same way my mother's voice tore through mine. But it was not only that. There were older scars, wounds that time could not close. I still woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, my heart racing as if I were once again in the concrete courtyard before the blade. The nightmares returned, the commanding voices, the cruel laughter of the men who destroyed my home. These were memories that surfaced without warning, sometimes even in the middle of prayer, turning silence into torment. Survivor's guilt also haunted me. Why did I escape while so many others had no chance? Why was I rescued when so many were still trapped in the same cycle of pain? The breaking point came when a girl was brought to our underground church. She was just over 12 years old, trembling non-stop, and her lost look revealed she had been hurt by someone from her own family. Seeing her made something inside me explode. It was as if all the scenes I tried to forget returned at once, violently. Her injustice reignited in me the old anger, the same that once drove me to thoughts of vengeance. I remembered the men who had scarred Layla's life, the orders I had obeyed without question, the innocents who suffered because of decisions like mine. Suddenly I wanted to be Lionheart again, not to obey orders but to impose my own justice. That night I almost fell. I locked myself in the shelter's small bathroom. The dusty mirror reflected a face divided between two lives. I clenched my fists and pressed them against the glass. The anger burned like fire in my bones. An inner voice, the same that had dominated me so many times, whispered, "Go back to who you were. Take back your strength, bring justice with your own hands." Hatred seemed to offer momentary relief, and for an instant I saw myself about to let darkness swallow me again. At that exact moment, the door opened slowly and Layla walked in. She said nothing at first. She just walked over to me, took my hand, still clenched in a fist, and placed it on her own chest. I felt her heartbeat, steady, constant, reminding me that life still pulsed in us. Then, in a low but resolute voice, she said, "We are not what was done to us, and you are not what you did." Those words pierced my heart deeper than any speech or warning. For the first time I realized I was not defined by my mistakes, nor by the injustices I had suffered. There was something greater at work, something that did not depend on my strength or my vengeance. Days later, the pastor of the church called me aside. He was a simple man with a graying beard who also carried scars from the past. In his hands was an old Bible, worn by time. He opened it to Romans chapter 8, verse 1, and read to me, "Therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." That sentence fell on me like water on dry ground. I had lived years believing condemnation was inevitable, that my life was forever marked by blood and violence. But now I heard that there was a different promise, a path that did not condemn me to what I had been. It was there that the turning point happened. I understood that if I insisted on returning to hatred, I would only be prolonging the slavery of my soul. But if I accepted that new truth, I could even turn my wounds into something useful. The pastor told me that God does not waste pain, He redeems it. Those words echoed like a calling. Instead of returning to violence, I decided to use my scars as a tool. I began to sit with other men who, like me, had carried weapons and obeyed blind orders. Instead of speaking about strategies of war, I spoke about the weight of guilt, the emptiness that no military victory could fill, and the hope I had found. The wound that had almost destroyed me became ministry. I began to listen to stories, to offer comfort, and to say something I myself needed to hear every day. You are not defined by what you did. There is forgiveness. There is new life. That was my turning point, the decisive inflection point. The worst day of my life would no longer be the last chapter. I had discovered that pain could be transformed into mission, and that even my darkest nights could illuminate someone else's path. And though there were still marks and memories, I knew I no longer carried the weight of my story alone. After that turning point, something began to take root in me like never before. The community that welcomed me suggested that I choose a new name, not to erase who I had been, but to mark that a new identity was being born. And that is how I came to be called Paul. The meaning pierced me like an arrow, the persecutor who became a preacher, the man who once lived to destroy but who was rescued to build. Every time someone called me by that name, I remembered that my story was no longer written by the hands of shame, but by the hands of grace. The Bible, which before had been only a distant book, now became my daily medicine. I held on to texts like Ephesians chapter 1 verse 5, where it says that in Christ we are adopted as children. That word adoption broke me inside. I, who had been rejected by my own mother, was now reminded every day that there was a father who would never reject me. Those pages became like fresh bread in the desert, food that sustained the soul. The practices were simple. There were no magic formulas, no heavy rituals. The prayers we made were short but filled with truth. Lord, we are here. Heal us. Give us strength. And that simplicity brought a freedom I had never known. The community embraced me without asking about my past, without demanding proof. I could simply be someone in the process of healing. One of the most remarkable experiences was when I had counseling with a sister who was a former Muslim, who had suffered mutilation, and yet spoke with unshakable peace. She helped me understand that pain can be transformed into testimony, that Christ is able to redeem even the deepest scars, and that transformation did not remain only in me. Layla began to regain the voice that pain had silenced. Her laughter once again filled the small spaces where we lived. Little by little we began to disciple wounded couples, offering not easy solutions but listening, prayer, and the certainty that there is hope beyond tragedies. I would sit before broken men and women marked by violence, look them in the eye and say, "You are seen. Jesus sees you." It was like repeating to them what the man in white had said to me that night in the warehouse. Our message was not only for the victims. We also spoke to those who had been violent, because I myself knew what it was to carry blood on my hands. The grace of Christ extends to both without denying justice but offering a path of redemption. He takes upon himself the vengeance that consumes and makes room for the healing of victims. This was the truth that shaped us. And if you hear me today, know this: no one is too far away. If God reached a soldier shaped by terror and a wife devastated by violence, he can reach you too in the living room of your house. Through an unexpected video, as the debates of Kirk were for me, through a dream, or even in a simple church hidden from the world. Freedom does not mean the absence of danger. I still live with risks, I still carry scars, but the slavery to fear has ended. Christ conquered through love, not demanding blood but giving his own blood. And it was that love that transformed ruins into mission. Today I know that God does not waste pain. He transforms every wound into a bridge to reach others. My scars are no longer hidden shames, but marks that declare that new life is possible.
And after hearing this incredible story, I want to speak directly to you who have followed along until now. This account of Karim and Layla shows us that there is no life so destroyed that it cannot be restored by the love of Christ. Maybe you are living through pains that no one understands, carrying scars that seem to have no cure. But just as it happened with them, today can also be your day to start again. If deep in your heart you feel this calling, I want to invite you to take a step of faith right now. Repeat out loud, wherever you are: I accept Jesus as Lord and Savior of my life. And to make this public, write in the comments the phrase, "I accept Jesus." This can be the beginning of the greatest transformation in your story. And if this message touched you, go ahead and check if you are already subscribed here to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave your like, because this helps this content reach even more lives that need to hear this hope. And for those who stayed until the end, also write in the comments, "I love Jesus," because this way we will create together a chain of faith that can inspire thousands of people. And get ready, because the next video is already appearing here on the screen. It is an impressive testimony. Stoned alive for leaving Islam, after watching Kirk's videos, she almost lost her life. You will not want to miss it, because it is another real story of courage, transformation, and salvation. Click now, because God still has so much to speak to you.